why did I think about going into a disaster response framework for the things that I do? It's probably the fact I grew up in a household where my father was a war refugee. And as a child, he was displaced from the Ukraine and placed in forced labor camps under the Germans in World War II. And he survived, and those stories of hunger, displacement, deprivation stayed with him. And we heard about those growing up at the dinner table. So talk about uncomfortable, right? He was always made sure that as a family, we would help people.
Welcome to Investing in Regeneration. This podcast is about changing how we understand, plan, and finance projects so that finance becomes a driver for better decisions, not just the last step in the process. In each episode, we unpack a real deal or initiative through three lenses: understanding, planning, and financing. We explore how it came about, who worked together, and what needs to change for these innovations to become mainstream. Because the real bottleneck is not capital. It is how investments are originated, structured, and brought to bankability. Our financial systems can do more than financing change. They can help shape it. Good morning, Illya. Nice to see you. For everyone listening to us, I'm delighted and honored to welcome Illya Azaroff, currently serving as president of the American Institute of Architects. He's an architect, a geographer, and an internationally recognized leader in disaster response, climate adaptation, resilient design, and regenerative planning strategy, with over 30 years of experience. He is also the founder of Plus Lab Architect, whose mission is to build resilient capacity while giving underserved communities a greater voice and visibility. He's also a professor at New York City College of Technology and works with cities, governing bodies, and design teams around the world to strengthen resilience and regenerative capacity. That's also how we met, I think, in Sharm el-Sheikh some years ago. Yeah, welcome, Illya, to Investing in Regeneration, Transforming Planning and Finance Through System Thinking, a podcast about three urgent revolutions: understanding, planning, and financing. I am a firm believer, as stated by Paul Hawken in his book Regeneration, that ending the climate crisis within one generation, that to get there as fast as we need to tackle the root cause. And actually, the root cause of global warming is a massive disconnection between each other, between people and nature, and within nature itself, to a great degree caused by our pollution and degradation. So regenerating and reversing the climate crisis is really about reconnecting those broken strands. That is what real solutions are, as opposed to standalone techniques and technology trying to fix the problem. And that's why in this episode, we will try to unpack the entire investment cycle and dive deep with the leaders behind pioneering investment programs, funds, and initiatives through three lenses. Understanding. What was the understanding that preceded planning of investment and how those investments have been financed? We explore these initiatives, and we want to understand and take you along on how did they came about, who worked together, which perspectives, sectors, and disciplines shaped them, how finance was structured to close what is often a financial viability gap, because we're talking most of the time about public goods and public services, and what would need to change for these pioneering regenerative models to become mainstream. And that is exactly what we will do today with Illya, diving deep into his vision to advance the leadership of AI members around the world. More than 100,000 members in more than 120 countries, so that they, architects, can become increasingly active agents in regenerating communities and ecosystems. So, Illya, now we can get to your plans as president of the American Institute of Architects. I was looking at your inauguration speech, and I know you have adopted the slogan, "Leadership Can Wait." Could you tell us more about it? And why is this important for your plans this year?
Thanks, Mónica. It's great to be here. And thanks for having me. This is an amazing opportunity. The slogan, "Leadership Can't Wait," it really is a calling for my colleagues, architects around the world, to really stand up and get involved in this work that we are discussing today. We have a very short amount of time, and coming forward to lead these communities, lead the communities that our architects live in to a better future, really is the imperative that we have. we often sit back and describe the issues that we face rather than really getting deeply involved. And regeneration needs all hands on deck. Given the wicked problems we face today, architects can't sit on the sideline any longer. So when I say leadership can't wait, I'm calling to them. Your leadership is so needed right now in the world today. Stand up, get involved. About the pillars of this, I think it's important to understand the role of the architect. As architects, we're systems thinkers and conveners. If you take those two pieces, you think about that role, bringing together all stakeholders in communities, large and small, is really necessary to understand the issues that people face and find a collective way forward, an agreement of how we can get there. The other part is systems thinkers, understanding all the systems at play, whether it's infrastructure, water, housing, energy, health services, food distribution. As architects, we understand those systems and the impact that decisions have across those community lifelines. So that's really important to understand. Closing the gap is really our next piece of that. But that really is the basis of Leadership Can't Wait and the call for what an essential profession is in this fight for a better planet.
Wow, thank you. I think something that stood with me is that architects are system thinkers and conveners. And so
Yes.
you're calling on their leadership to stand up and actually bring all those parts together and in a way trigger that deeper understanding, right? That we need to plan investments. So in a way, you already told me somehow about what role do you foresee for architects, but I still would like to know what role do you see them taking into closing the implementation gap of water resilience, climate adaptation, and nature regeneration strategies? If they have to, you mentioned in your inaugural speech that you want to get them a bit uncomfortable, so I would like to actually understand how is that role moving maybe from the traditional role they might have been taking?
That's a perfect question. And I am making my colleagues uncomfortable when we go forward. Let's start with that idea of closing the gap. This last year at COP30 in Belém, the national adaptation plans were launched. And if you take a look at the national adaptation plans all across the world, those coming forward, you can see the role that fits the architect. The architect becomes a critical connector with the needs of the community and satisfying those national adaptation plans that unlock financing. So that to me is really critical. What is uncomfortable is architects typically are working at the scale of the owner with their finance, along with the builder and some engineering services to create a building or a small campus, right? There are some of us, like myself, that are working at much larger scales that understand that we need to expand our systems thinking process. And one of those things is, in addition to all those systems I mentioned, we now have to look at ecosystem services. We need to look at bioregions as part of the systems we are considering in our decision-making process. So what's uncomfortable is that the scale of information to even create the smallest project is expanded. And to be able to unlock the potential of what your project does to advance national adaptation plans, even at the small scale of doing a couple of houses, is really, really important at this time. And it also aligns with that financing, which is a little, it's almost ephemeral. There it is. There's the financing. How do we get to it? And so that's what I see in closing that gap, our ability to bring those communities forward with their ideas to really get at that financing.
Yeah, I think finance is the outcome, right? If everything goes well, we get a finance. And that's what I love to work and discuss with you, what comes all before so that we see finance flowing. Now, what I have noted is one of the challenges is the scale. And essentially, if I hear you, you want your architects to understand the huge responsibility that they could take and the activation that they could do of impact and zoom out.
Yes.
And try to embody at whatever scale the project is, what the impact multipliers can be for this piece of investment they have in commission and so forth. That's amazing. Thank you. Now, could you walk us through the theory of change and impact pathway you foresee for your plans this year? and how this strengthening of leadership and the change of role that you just explained could impact the future of the communities where they work, your members.
Oh, certainly. I'm really glad you asked about the theory of change. It's something that I think we should all be going through, whether it's our practice or organization. And over the past several years, the AIA has gone through this exercise for the whole national body and this idea of we're in 120 countries. And the critical volunteer committees that we have formed that work through governing of climate adaptation, climate action, response, the groups that produce education materials for us as professionals, and those outward-facing ones for communities, those are all part of the theory of change. And that really began to show us a couple of really key things. We need to get out of our box. So I love the question about how do you make people uncomfortable? Our theory of change told us that as a profession, we need to start getting very comfortable with the uncomfortable. And we have to have greater impact and outreach in the public realm more than we ever had before. And that is really, really important to activate people in this manner. And there's going to be a lot more coming this year. We are really shifting gears. We're adopting a disaster risk reduction pledge for architects. And our ethos as architects is the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So when we think about the theory of change saying you as an architect, health, safety, and welfare of the public, then what does the change in today's ecosystem and society and threat begin to tell you about your work product? That's what we're embracing. We need to prepare our members, bring forward new education elements so they're prepared to really jump into these uncomfortable places that you have highlighted. So I'm thrilled we've gone through it. It's really given us the fuel to move forward very fast. Trying to steer a ship with 100,000+ members is difficult. So finding guideposts that we can really navigate this is rather important. And the theory of change gave us that opportunity.
I've noted the disaster risk reduction pledge you're preparing. And I love that you said that as architects, you're looking at health, welfare, and safety of people, which already we will get later on onto some of these regenerative design principles, but it's looking at the well-being of the communities, right? Basically, where you work. And thank you for sharing your theory of change. And I like the idea that you're preparing them
Yes.
to jump into that discomfort, knowing in a way with the tooling that you need. And I do believe there are tools that help us to deal with multidisciplinarity, right? And system thinking. So I'm really looking forward also to dive deep into some of those skills that you plan to prepare them for. Look, you say it's difficult to steer with 100,000+ members, but when you're able to do that, also setting up an example, because actually if you want your architects to be successful, they not just have to convene, right, and understand, but they have to lead in a serving ways. So I feel like it's a great task that you have at hand because you want to make change happen, but at the same time, the how you're going to make it is going to make it much or less impactful. So going to that, I'm convinced, and that's why in this podcast, I always want to get into who is the person behind it, because every pioneering initiative takes discomfort, vulnerability. So there is always a courageous leader with a personal commitment to make a better place, a better world. And so, like I said, I follow your trajectory, and in your inauguration, again, you say, let's dream big. Let's dream of changing the world. So could you tell us more about yourself? How did you come to want to do this? To be the
Sure.
president of the American Institute of Architects, to do this type of work, and some of your life journey?
You know, I think that everybody has a unique story, and I wear a lot of different hats, even in your introduction. You know, I'm a professor at New York City College of Technology. So I'm really invested in bringing the next generation of young architects along. My focus there is just like we're talking about. It's about climate action and regeneration. And professionally in my office, working globally, partnering with local not-for-profits and communities are kind of what makes me tick. Those communities that are really at the forefront of climate disruption are where I show up. Currently, we're working in Hawaii, we're working in Alaska, in the Caribbean, we're working in several European countries, Eastern European countries. And that is really important to frame. But if I really think about where it started, I guess where it all really started is really with disaster relief and response. I'm a disaster responder, and I've seen this kind of devastating effect to communities all over the world. I've seen people that have lost everything. And when you see people that have lost everything, it really changes you. It changes you to understand that we are all the same as human beings, and our desire for what livelihood is very much the same. And that is really important. Seeing the process of those communities recover and being part of that, working closely with them to co-design for a better future takes a lot of dedication and effort. Yet that work is essential to me to secure the future for generations to come. And if I'd really drill down before that, why did I think about going into a disaster response framework for the things that I do? It's probably the fact I grew up in a household where my father was a war refugee. And as a child, he was displaced from the Ukraine and placed in forced labor camps under the Germans in World War II. And he survived, and those stories of hunger, displacement, deprivation stayed with him. And we heard about those growing up at the dinner table. So talk about uncomfortable, right? He was always made sure that as a family, we would help people. And he wanted us to help people in our lives. So that has naturally extended to who I am. And that extends to my family. I have two boys that are now both in college. It's hard to believe they've grown so fast. The other thing I've seen is they're concerned for the future. In fact, their entire generation did not have the same hope that maybe you or I had growing up. We can see a horizon infinite. I can do anything. I can be anything if I really just can see. And that has now become my kind of North Star. I work intensely hard to securing a better future for them and bringing more people to this work. I know we collectively can have a profound effect. To change things for better and giving that next generation hope is what I try to do every day. Giving my family hope, your family hope, that is my North Star and why I do what I do. I'm not going to stop until we've made that possibility a reality. It's the truth of what I do every day, my why for what I do every day.
I am very thankful that you shared also the experiences of your father who shaped your view and actually made you care. Between the stories of our parents or what we also saw in our childhood that make us warm for what's going on, some values that we got, but also at the same time, hoping our kids do not need to experience the same. And as you say, now with the climate crisis, even more because we know that their perspective of the future might be changing. So it's incredible how I think it's all about reconnecting those broken strands, right? Like you're pushing for a mission that connects you with your past generations, but also care for the
Future.
for the future. So
My
it's
gosh.
really thank you for sharing. Now I want to go into your plans more in depth and also the type of processes that architects are part of. So the planning processes. Could you tell us more about the investment planning and urban transformation processes architects normally are part of? Which roles and stakeholders play a crucial role to make them a success and sustainable over time? And are there different actors at different phases of the investment cycle?
Absolutely. Before we dive into that, I do want to just mention just a basis for architects, especially with the AIA. When we think about what good design is, our framework for design excellence, and this governs all architects, it's a definition of what 21st century architecture is and at its best. It has to be resilient, it has to be sustainable, it has to support health, and it has to support equity. Those four pillars are really important to this conversation, this part of the conversation. And so when you're asking about the normal operations for architects, we are governed by our ethical charge of health, safety, and welfare. But this framework for design excellence that is now under this evolution to move towards regenerative design is rather important to that exact conversation because we will not engage in things that are unethical. We cannot. And we must support projects that hit those four pillars. So generally for an architect, and to speak in generality, the other part of your question was what that structure looks like. Because it varies from size of the firm, the trajectory of their involvement. But in general, the stakeholders are typically the owner, the builder, some city agencies, and the financing piece of that is generally coming from the owner's side. That has been the traditional way of looking at it. That could expand for larger projects with developers, which we do a lot of work in that aspect, along with not-for-profits that get involved. Now, that financing is then put together based on how successful your team makes a proposition. You're making a proposition that satisfies the community, and it also satisfies the city to its goals, whether it's SDG goals, whether it's the hazard mitigation plan goals, whatever it may be. And once you satisfy those, it's attractive to the finance model. But here's the key. Once you satisfy that, it really is important to see how capital investors then look at your project, and you have to demonstrate an ROI in multiple capacities. The ROI on human capital for the city, ROI on taxation for city and state, ROI for the cost base of the project to its return on investment to those investors. And so when you're looking at all those ROIs, you hear what's missing? The return on investment for ecosystem services, gross ecosystem product, what the entire benefit of regenerative design brings to the table, and the cultural capital of human beings is not part of that ROI. Yet, when you look at the ethics of what I stated that we must do as architects, we have to consider those things in our propositions. So that's typically the finance model. It's expanded, and then there's a bit of the gaps that I'm starting to illuminate, but boy, it's different all along the way. I can describe a little bit about some of who we bring on board as architects that are practicing regenerative design. It's a little bit different design team.
Okay. That I would like to go on that.
Sure.
And just now to reflect back, I think that when you said though, right, like good design, right, that's resilient, sustainable, it should be result in resilience, sustainable health and equity. I would say that actually in those four words already, of course, there is a regeneration approach. The problem might be, and this is also what I'm finding out more and more as I go deeper into regeneration, is that sustainability is the outcome. But how we get there, right? That's where regenerative design comes in. The problem is that somehow we have focused on kind of start to say this is sustainable, but actually sustainability is the long-term result of designing things that have a regenerative logic. So I totally agree with you on how do we make sure that if the owners or the cities are not putting the ROI on the regeneration part, and so in social and environmental terms, right? Because I think you also pointed out to communities, because regeneration is about bringing back the tissue that we have in our silos, we have eliminated. And so I really just wanted to reflect back on that, but also tell us more about the different disciplines that could play a role in shaping this strategic plans along with communities. And we can do this more along the regenerative plans that you have.
Sure, absolutely. So as architects, the design team is typically extensive, and I'm going to include some of the things that we end up including. The different disciplines such as engineers and specialists on the environmental front are always involved. As an example, we're part of this amazing regenerative project coming forward in New York City that has a design team that is full of architects, resilient specialists, regenerative specialists, landscape architects, structural, electrical engineers, renewable energy consultants, sustainable specialists. Those are coupled with developers and community stakeholders. And then we have the design financing for the ROI, but included with this are all of the community stakeholders, the specialists who understand the culture of that community and what that desire and return on investment might look like there. So when we think about all of those systems at play, that is where our design team is advancing. And personally, we include folks like reef restoration specialists, folks that are looking at agroforestry, agropharma, specialists on medicinal use of native plant species. We're looking at how you really look at bio-based materials and technology that has come forward in the marketplace that we've never seen before. So that expansion of disciplines and knowledge base has become critical to a regenerative design process because it breaks the traditional mold, but not shatter it. It actually adds to its flavor and its complexity. The key is how do you get all of those stakeholders to work together, but also respect one another if they've never worked together before? And that is what we see everywhere.
Yeah, we're coming to one very important question that I have.
Sure.
And you just touched upon it because you said that you're trying to enrich and bring all this diversity, which will come back, has to do with one of these regenerative design principles, right? The edge effect abundance. But before we go on to that, you said that one of the hardest things is to enable that this goes harmonically, that everybody feels as they are as important to the process and they are heard. And so what skills, values, and behaviors do architects and urban planners need to embrace to achieve this truly participatory process and a regenerative outcome?
This is really at the heart of our discussion, and you're right on. To me, this is how we have to transform practice into regenerative engagement. We have the essential skills as architects for convening, and that's a very important skill that a lot of professions don't have. And recognizing that skill in this environment is rather important. We also have to recognize a couple of really key things is that when we think about this process and getting into regenerative design, we have to recognize that this is about the uniqueness of an individual place. One size doesn't fit all. The other piece that architects generally bring, if we set our egos aside, that we are guests in any community that are working with, in that communities are a larger part of ecosystems and bioregions. So these are the expansive pieces. This is the pieces that we really need to leverage the skills that we have, but expand the knowledge base that we're bringing to bear on this. We have to be able to delve into history and culture as part of the unique characters of place. And it's rather important that when we're looking at any of these long-term planning responses, that we understand that long-term engagement builds trust. So I think these are not new to architects. It's just how we have to expand those into bridging the gaps, into being effective at what's necessary now. The thing that a lot of communities don't understand or don't have a great deal of experience with is bringing the science of what climate projections look like, for example. That's key to the process as well. And designing for tomorrow is something architects don't communicate well. So I might be working with you and you're not-for-profit on creating something. But when we are making decisions as architects, we have to be able to talk to you about designing this for the next 7 generations. This building, this project, this process is going to last 100 plus years, maybe 150 years or 200 years. So we are considering those things, but are not communicating them in the right process. And the good news is that plays into regenerative design very well. We are really forwarding that piece as an essential underpinning or foundation for our decision process. That's really important. There's a lot more that I can go over here because we have to really begin to understand what the true regenerative planning process in response to these systems looks like. That is the uptake of the profession right now. But it's also the greatest opportunity that we have. It's the biggest opportunity, and I'm hoping that my colleagues really understand why I'm pushing for this very, very hard.
Very happy to hear about your plans. And I think as I took notes from what you explained, there's some technical aspects, right?
Very much so.
Climate projections. Yet seems to me that the crucial part is on the what we normally consider soft skills, like communicating.
Yeah.
Expanding that knowledge base means you have to orchestrate a much more diverse ecosystem in the planning process. And so, yeah, seems that these skills, they need to be strengthened as well as to some technical aspects of understanding that the future will not look like the past projections. Now, I would like that we go into the more technical aspects of urban resilience and regeneration.
Good.
And also how you to describe how, from the extensive experience you have, how these plans move into implementation and which important implementation and financial gaps are there to bridge, especially gaps in terms of you have understood the strategic and economic business case of these investments, but how do you get them to the design and the standards, that it's also having that regenerative approach for the long term and in a wider sense for the whole community. So from a societal point of view, maybe much more is required that asset design requires for, you could say, the direct commercial and financial business case.
There is a great deal of different requirements for regenerative processes. And so I'll take that piece of it first, and then we'll delve into financing. Because when you go to work with a community, adaptation happens at a speed of trust, right? We've heard that a lot in adaptation and finance over the past couple of decades. So when you go to work with a community, you have to be ready to stay involved with that community for decades. And that is the only way that you begin to seriously move forward. You have to become a trusted partner, so that engagement gives the community an opportunity to look at long-term planning and visions and look at financing all along the way. You're not going to get it all at once. It has to be something that develops over a long period of time. The interesting thing is, as someone who understands shocks and stresses and adaptation, all along the way, people are going to change in that process. The community leaders will change. Some will retire. Some will emerge as new leaders. But same in government and finance. The people you're working with for those projects constantly change and turn over. So what is the constant here? The constant is building these relationships, and those relationships are really important, that you gain that trust and move forward. For me, I'm very grateful for the communities that I've worked in, because I've learned more from them than I have brought to them, and that is the absolute truth. But in terms of financing, there are several hurdles that we're currently facing. Particularly, it's evident in understanding that communities generally they already understand the problems that they face. They also understand several of the solutions that they want to have to implement, and visualizing those solutions to government along with banking and finance is really our challenge. So the role that I see that is really important here, and those things that I do in my office, is to really translate those goals and to bring the technical expertise that you're talking about to enhance and propose solutions that align with community values and culture. Culture is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Once that communication rolls forward, the government approval and buy-in comes much easier. So think about that. If we look at a national adaptation plan and you do community engagement, they're going to tell you what you need. It aligns with the government, and you as the architect and your team, you translate that. Now you have a report that understands what that project looks like. Visualization, drawings, everything that has the technical aspect of projecting into the future and harvesting all of the critical information that align with resilience planning. They're aligned with regional adaptation plans that the government has forwarded. You have all that together. Now you have this ready for financing. This is the issue. And we're seeing it everywhere. There is a serious fear from banking and finance, even though they've pledged to give money for this type of work. Institutions are very fearful of giving you money for things they've never seen before.
Yes.
We're in a moment of complete transformation. So the way that we're doing our work, the teams we're doing our work with, and the type of outcome that we are seeing come forward has never been built on this planet ever. That is what regenerative design is. You're seeing things that no one has ever done before. So when I am at that place, and if I'm in banking and finance and I'm seeing this for the first time, it looks like it's hitting all of the requirements. It's looking like it's meeting the national adaptation plans, the community, everything. This is great. It's too good to be true. And I'm the one signing off on unleashing billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars for these communities to advance. That is a huge responsibility. So you just mentioned communication. How do we better communicate that and remove the fear from the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people who've never seen this work? And that's going to change as the work comes forward and smaller examples come forward. Thankfully, there's regenerative projects and planning that have come forward, and we're starting to use those as touchstones and cobble that together. Say, here's a puzzle of what's been done. Please unleash the money. And I don't blame people for acting out of fear. If I make a mistake kind of mentality, then what happens to all that money? But inaction today is really the Achilles heel for these communities, because as I keep saying, leadership can't wait, but this bank and finance can't wait. It's pledged globally from the World Bank for all of these institutions, insurance, reinsurers. They're dying to finance all of this work. And we're putting together the proposals. And so the gap there is, it's about human nature and fear. I'm more than happy to sit with any banking and finance person with these drawings, plans, people, places to verify what that looks like. Because quite frankly, the ROI on regenerative design doesn't exist. There isn't a body of work enough that tells us there's an ROI. We only have the theory, the science, and some practical solutions. So that in any case would make anyone fearful. If it was a small amount of money, great. And we've taken that on. As architects, we've done small pilot projects. We've done single family houses. We've done restoration of bird sanctuaries. We've done work in pilot communities and just convince government, wait, okay, if you are fearful of this, how about we just do one thing? And as soon as we do the one thing, you go, wow, that's amazing. Can we do more? So we're at that point. It's going to take another, unfortunately, I think to your quote at the beginning, we could do this all in a generation. Easily. We see the way forward. The financing is there. The will is there. But until we remove that fear, that's going to hold us back from making this a single generation transformation.
Yeah, fear, more from a spiritual sense. I'm a great fan of the Jesuits, and they said, when you know is fear behind your decision, you know you're going in the wrong direction. Still, unfortunately, the systems, because financiers, the systems have been designed to finance what has been proven. And so how do we get finance to prove the future we need? That's actually what I love. Yeah, I'm trying to spark this conversation because I think, like you say, I noticed that it's great. It's like the ROI of regenerative design doesn't exist. How do we develop this? And how do we create incentives so that financiers can actually embrace that part? Now let's go into looking at your initiative, looking at what is regenerative design and the plans you have for the AIA members, and look at it through 4 of the regenerative design principles. There are 8, but for matter of time, I have looked at the ones that relate much more to the work that you're doing. And so the first is around principle number 3 is innovative, adaptive, and responsive. So in a world with change is both ever-present and accelerating, the qualities of innovation and adaptability are critical to health. And in a way, there is a belief that when Darwin said, in the struggle for survival, the fittest win out at the expense of the rivals, probably what he meant is the most fit is that one that fit best and is most adaptable to a changing environment. And so if we look at investments and the investment case for adaptation and resilience, how do you conceptualize and measure resilience impacts? And knowing that there is so much unknown, how do you build flexibility to deal with changing in conditions over time in people, in maybe their desires even? Because uncertainties in all aspects, not just, let's say, in terms of climate, in the planning process, in the contracts, and so forth.
There's a lot to unpack there because when I think about it, there's the things that I'm really excited that I'm hearing in the marketplace today that kind of answers this, and that's GEP, the gross ecosystem product. And so we think about flexibility in finance. We're already seeing the financial stack in banking and finance to support regenerative design come forward, not just as an ethos or idea. If you think about COP15 in Montreal, this is the EcoCOP. This is only a couple of years ago. They really identified that ecosystem services need to be financed. And now that's part of what your design element is. You must have resilience and sustainability as 2 sides of the coin, but in the center of that coin, you have to have ecosystem services to really complete that coin. And then if you deposit that in a project for the future, you create equity across communities. That's the goal. So that's my hope, is this flexibility is already there. And you're already seeing that new products from banking and finance have come forward that are about the finance of this type of work, of regenerative work, of ecosystem services, valuation of ecosystem services, and how communities or nation states can value what they have in the environment and leverage that for development. It can't be at the cost of the environment. So that's encouraging. That is one, ethically right. It is the adaptation of finance models that are great because new products are coming forward. Very few architects know about those models, and bank and finance don't have a clear path for which you can tap into them. That's the issue. You said, hey, this is great. You've just created a $500 billion set of products across
But
bank and
nobody
finance.
knows about it, and they don't know how to find a way.
How do I get it? And so we have really worked hard. We've been able to tap into some of those in some of our projects, but I tell you, it's hard. So,
and that's where we have to work on together, Illya, because we have to create that plumbing so that people know the options, but also that there is some accountability. And we will come now into that with the principle of empowered participation, because they create these ideal funds that had all these criteria, don't find the deals.
Yeah.
How do we create the dialogue that shows, hey, if you tweak this, if you create that bridge to another funder who has another wish, then we can apply.
That's the one-to-one. So in banking and finance, unfortunately, the people that are afraid to unleash the financing do not have the same systems thinking of 1 to 3, 1 to 5, 1 to 10. That's regenerative thinking instead of 1-to-1. I give you this money, you'll give me the product that you promised. What I'm asking for is the money, so I give you not just the product that we're promising, but the 5x that it creates because of all the systems it crosscuts. And that's the lack of the ROI. We can't measure those things yet. We can't measure carrying capacity of a site before and after in a fundamental way that banking and finance trusts. That's the opportunity. To me, that's the opportunity.
Yeah.
Is if you are out there and you know how to write code, script, leverage AI, remote sensing services to really understand these things, how do we take a look at ecosystem services, measure them, turn them into something that is reportable and across the world people accept? Banking and finance already has the money sitting there that no one's tapping into. So let's use that number, prove that we can do it, and then have that as what you just asked. What is the regulatory piece that we have to then prove that we did what we said we did? And can that same product tell banking and finance 2 years after, this is what has happened, 5 years after, this is what had happened?
And I mean, we're going quite deep into this, but I think it's important to do so. And the sad part, Illya, is that even governments have started in their budgeting, in their planning of investments, to be budget focused and fear driven. And so what happened is that normally, right, and a financier would come in if the governments have a public contract that will pay for a specific outcomes. But governments have also forgot like that their finance are not like, I have a salary and that I spend it or not. When they invest in these projects, they are creating new revenues from the future. So it's an investment. And I think that is what I'm so passionate about mission-driven investment planning, because it reminds you that money also doesn't work like that at the national level, that
Right.
it's an expense. No, it's an investment. So yeah, I think that's the part, is that we get the two worlds looking into very limited metrics. You're with your great project.
It is exactly that, Monica. You're right on, because if you've read all of the reports that come out of the World Bank for different nations, the path is clear. The amount of money necessary is clear. The workforce development is clear. The benefit is clear. And those are great documents. And the financial stack seems to be there. But the decision makers, whether it's I'm in a 4-year term political appointee or whatever it is, that does not translate to the long-term investment and the ROI that you just mentioned. That these new territories that are opening up because of these conversations and what regenerative design poses is a complete game changer in economic development worldwide that actually repairs the planet. And no one's ever done that before, but we are all doing that. We're pushing very hard for it. It's a complete change. And boy, when people recognize this, that fear goes into overdrive of, oh my gosh, we can make a lot of money at this. And look, I'm not looking at this as a profit center. I really have that ethos. I want this world to be better for my kids. But boy, if I have to pull that lever, you will make 10 times the money you were making last year if you only listen to what all of us collectively in regenerative design are saying and act on it.
Yeah. I mean, we are in the process of getting finance for change. And of course, the idea is eventually we change finance, but we need to start somewhere, right? And to move that incentive in the right direction. So now let's go to empower participation, which is principle number 4. And I love how this comes from the work of John Fullerton and the Capital Institute. And it says, in an interdependent system, fitness comes from contributing in some way to the health of the whole. The quality of empowered participations mean that all parts must be in relationship with the larger whole in ways that not only empower them to negotiate for their own needs, but also enables them to add their unique contribution to our health and well-being of the larger wholes in which they are embedded. While inclusiveness might be morally desirable, empowered participation is more like a non-negotiable quality of systemic health for the entire system. So, to what extent do different actors, public authorities, investors, operators, affected communities, indigenous communities, when they are part of that planning process, have real agency in shaping the investments to be made in their communities?
You touched on something here, and especially with indigenous people. First and foremost, regenerative design is healing versus curing. Healing the whole, the holistic approach to solutions and planning, incorporating systems that are beyond what the normal process is, includes those indigenous people, the indigenous wisdom, and marrying that with technology. And we don't want to take this as an additive process. The agency that indigenous people and local communities have is enormous, because a tenet of regenerative design is understanding the true uniqueness of place through its history and culture, its ecosystems, and all of those pieces to actually get to this idea of healing versus curing, the whole versus removing a symptom. Oh, it's flooding. Great. I'll build a wall. No, that's curing. Healing is understanding water is the most precious resource on the planet. Hey, we're flooding. Okay. Then how do we leverage that water to take care of our food desert? Make sure that we have urban cooling. We take it into a place where flooding and extra water is looked at as a benefit rather than a life safety issue. That is a holistic approach of really understanding in just one tiny circumstance. So when you ask about indigenous communities, the indigenous communities around the world hold the key for regenerative design. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. We have to take a step back and look at what our role is and understand that to sit in those communities and rooms, I have learned so much more from indigenous people, because they know for thousands upon thousands of years, their marriage to the earth is inextricable. And we, as someone who's educated in a Western society, have been so departed from that understanding of healing is second nature to them. And I've had to learn this along the way, and I continue to learn that. The agency that they have, if you truly want to get at regenerative design, is profound. That is the leadership that's necessary in not just sustaining ecosystem services of today, but actually regenerated, increasing carrying capacity around the world. So I always take this ethos in any regenerative process. I am a guest here. I'm a guest in every community I come to. And the long-term engagement that I have with them builds the trust. And I am a student of all of the history and knowledge that they bring forward. What I am bringing to them is visualization, synthesis of their ideas, and asking them, did I hear you correctly?
Mm-hmm.
And in that process, we've been able to unlock projects that the world has never seen before. Governments have been pleasantly surprised at what we present to them on behalf of the community, because these are truly the community ideas that have never come to a visualization, that have not been expressed in a way that matches the requirement of government and finance. Those ideas have always been there, but that role of translation is amazing. So when you ask about the agency of indigenous people and local folks, it's at the top. It is not an additive at the bottom. We always think about, here's been my design team and now we've added an extra. No, it's the absolute opposite. That community is the top of that apex, or the center of that whole, and we are being added to it as guests. So that's what I meant earlier in our conversation. We have to take our egos and step back and say, we are here as guests to learn and translate.
Maybe you're simply a bridge maker.
Yes.
To those resources or other things that they might not have access to. Now I'm going to another principle number 5, that is about a regenerative economy nurtures healthy and resilient communities and regions, each one uniquely formed by the essence of its individual history and place. So this principle is about honoring community and place, something we have lost with globalization. And so what aspects of the investments that you do in adaptation are you shaped through as architect are fundamentally shaped by local context and cannot be standardized? At the same time, what needs standardization without dishonoring community and place so that we can enable more capital to flow into adaptation?
When it comes down to the culture and community of place, I think that echoes what we just spoke about. What needs to be formalized in that process is really difficult to say. I think that at the heart of this is the fact that the whole ethos of regenerative design and circular economy, it's a circular expanding economy, not a circular only economy that is this big and remains this big. It's regenerative means that it is in a constant state of expansion. And so when you think about that, in the 20th century, we had creation of product and therefore waste. The waste needs to get buried or repurposed. Okay, you're moving towards balance and sustainability. Here's the difference between regeneration and sustainability is that it has much more of a balanced process and is wonderful.
And a status quo, right? Like in a way, you're trying to keep the status quo. Yeah.
Exactly. But in a world where each individual ecological footprint keeps shrinking because the population keeps growing, we have to look at regenerative process to increase carrying capacity so there's room for more people and there's abundance. So in a local community, this idea of waste, every product of waste is the opportunity for fuel of new production, innovation, and product is really important. So New York City just went to a required composting for everyone. And this is something they've been playing with for a while. Now, I know a lot of places around the world and people listen to your podcast. You're only doing that now? Yeah. So it was voluntary before that. Fast forward ahead, why aren't we taking that and turning that into the products for regeneration? The city has taken this on and they actually have a composting place that turns it into new soil. The soil is then distributed back to us in the city, and we use that for our own gardens and planting and enhancement of the parks. So that's great, right? That begins a regenerative process. But what else can we get from that? We can get biofuel, biochar. We can get all of these other products that we are missing in a total landscape of what a regenerative process means, that every waste is new product, new energy, new economy, new ways of doing things. So when I look at an individual community that has history and culture, and you begin to talk with the community folks there, they're not talking about the past and lamenting of what's been lost. Somewhat, yes. But what they're also displaying is what a successful, vibrant, self-sustaining community used to be like here. And it did work. So what has changed? Is it ethical? Is it the systems that we employ? All of those things. And what wisdom is in that community that can really spark the idea of regeneration. In communities, I work with a lot of island communities, and because islands are so quite quote unquote isolated, they've always had closed systems. And the closed systems, they always had self-sustaining success. Yet through colonization, they've gotten away from that. They've gotten away from those pieces. And when you really rediscover that, the communities already know what they need to do to become the most powerful place on that they can be. So you're asking the right question. And I'm telling you, we should be having a COP series just on Indigenous communities. And you could run thousands of programs for 2 weeks every year and not even scratch the surface of how we can change the world.
We have to get them to the foreground. So last one, that is about edge effect abundance. And that principle remind us that that's number 6, and that says creativity and abundance flourish synergistically at the edges of systems, where the bonds holding the dominant pattern in place are weakest. So, for example, we have salty water turning into fresh water. Those places we see much more biodiversity, right? And so, which partnerships across sectors or disciplines and types of knowledge have proved most regenerative in shaping this new type of infrastructure systems and investments that enable communities to thrive? And were there institutional and financial silos that limited that collaboration at the edges in the current state of matters.
This is really great. So I mentioned a bit about our teams that go forward, and depending on where we are looking at cultural leaders and community leaders, but folks that are in agroforestry, agropharma, traditional ways of farming, people who touch ecosystem services. And that's not traditionally what you put in your design team, nor is it what is traditionally funded in projects. So when you do a campus project, are you actually contacting the folks who do native species that have additional beneficial uses? Are you contacting the soil specialists that understand the acidity of the soil, the place where it needs to be repaired, the runoff of the water to change the pH of those edge conditions, that the water is beneficial for more biodiversity? Are you contacting those folks? And is banking finance supporting that? Not initially. So this is where the creativity has to come forward. You need to think about how you write the narrative of your project with the community. We've stopped doing architecture competitions, and we've taken that idea and the time that we would normally spend in that, and we have worked very hard at honing our skills in grant writing and understanding how to describe a project at its core to these circumstances. Because then when you go to banking and finance and say, for example, my community has a food desert, they might be going after a grant that says, you have 3,000 hungry people, we'll give you enough resources to feed 3,000 people X number of times a week. We will ask that same funder to say, we're doing a holistic project about how do you begin to repair soil conditions to plant things so people can grow their own food. We also need new roads and infrastructure to support the erasure of the food desert so people can feed themselves. We also want to take away invasive species and put in native plants so the ecosystem flourishes and then the food production becomes naturally more abundant. And when you write a proposal based on that, the funding agency or the grant agency that initially would say, you need 3,000 boxes of food for 3,000 families 3 times a week. That's what they're expecting to be asked for. So your process is, no, systems think. How do you have the holistic approach of healing the community? This community used to feed itself 100 years ago. How does it feed itself? And so you change the whole thinking of banking and finance. It still satisfies their umbrella of how they've written the grant.
Of metrics, right? Yeah.
Exactly. But you have to be able to be intelligent enough and collaborative enough with that community to bring in grant writers, to bring in the specialists of the community to say, this is what needs to happen. So we don't have to have you bring a semi-trailer truck of 300 boxes of food every week and pollute the environment. We would rather do it ourselves and then have an abundance that we can actually sell outside, create new economies, all of those things.
Couldn't agree more. And in some previous work that is a financing framework for water security, but basically it says the strategic investment case is very important. And I think sometimes disciplines like water or, energy, that's the part where they need to zoom out and then also align, the strategic fit of what they propose. And I think you're right on spot that once I was doing a work on what type of investment case is more important to different funders. And I think for impact investors, for philanthropists, the strategic case is the most important. You basically have to, I don't like the word, but you have to help them transcend their own paradigm.
Yes.
By explaining to them why what you're giving them is so much more than those boxes. So, oh my God, this is so exciting. Okay, but now we're coming to the end. I have a question which I know that you won't be afraid of because in your inaugural speech you said you want to make a better world. So when you step back and look across understanding, planning, and financing systems, where do you feel the next real breakthrough needs to happen? And if you had a magic one, where would you do changes tomorrow and over a week?
Wow. We talked about the banking and finance, but when I think about systems, very simple thing is part of the education. And this is education even of my own profession. Understanding the distinct difference for government officials, community leaders, the distinct difference between sustainability, adaptation, resilience, and regenerative processes is really important. They all seem to be in banking and finance, in government speak, ubiquitous, yet they are so distinctly different with driving towards the same horizon, but in different timescales and different results and different engagement processes. So if I could, it would be about a clear understanding of those different pieces, because then what would happen is that policy globally would change immediately. Not just in heads of government, but this is every small community, everywhere, every time, would change their policy in a complete understanding of what these keystone issues are, recognizing what regenerative design brings to complete transformation of the world in a single generation. That's where we're at. So that's what I would change, is that education of just those three things. Can we have a deep understanding of what these are? And it didn't take Antonio Guterres. Let's stop the spiral. We have to go through disaster risk reduction to get to our SDGs. Stop spending money immediately on sustainability unless you spend it on risk reduction first. You can't keep rebuilding communities after disasters and claim you're being sustainable. That is so clear a message. We do the same message for regenerative design. That is amazing. The second part of your question, the magic wand would be that regenerative design in all development projects is an absolute minimum by law.
Yes! Let's try. I'm in to get it in Latin America. Thank you so much, Illya. I think this has been an incredible, rich conversation with someone who is able to influence more than 100,000 architects all over the world, calling them to take the responsibility and also embrace that leadership with that listening capacity. And so I'm really proud to call you colleague and friend, and I'm really happy that you were here. And I encourage everyone to keep following your work and also your plans as a new president of the American Institute of Architects. Thank you for listening to Investing in Regeneration. But before you go, if this conversation sparked new ideas for how we understand, plan, or finance projects, I invite you to take one small step today. Leave a rating and a review. It helps this podcast reach the people who are shaping decisions. And please share this episode with a policymaker, a planner, an investor, or anyone who has the agency to influence how projects are originated, designed, and financed. This is not just about spreading a podcast. It's about joining a quiet revolution, reimagining finance, and embracing a new investment paradigm that reconnects people, nature, and the economy, and places finance at the service of life.